Are we in the modern world truly free, or do we still have a ruling class? What is this ruling class? Is it a family claiming world leadership since the days of Pharaoh? A loosely structured society of millionaires and notables? A highly organized business and financial network of global controllers? A shared set of dark religious tenets, or all of the above? To the curious, the seekers, and the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych Podcast. Today we are considering the modern ruling class from the points of view noted above. To begin our discussion, Ken has some thoughts about how they came together to coalesce into a group with enough reach to control billions of people with far less than 1% of the population.
Rise of Standard Oil. I would say fossil fuels had the biggest impact on the growth of economies, both that and also the growth of population. The movement toward, in the U.S., the city-country shift, just going back from a rural existence in the eras in the 1800s and moving into the era of the automobile and beyond. As we look at air travel that took over, passenger air travel really hit a high mark in the 40s and 50s and has continued when the jet engine came on board from Werner von Braun and the defeat of Germany in World War II. The world was sort of united in this transportation utopia. And my own feeling as a starting point would be that it enabled the social intercourse of people from around the globe, and naturally the people that were most able to afford that form of transportation and the social cohesiveness that came from frequent gatherings of the foundations and the colleges and basically the mobility, the revolution in mobility created this. Really, it's almost a retrenchment going back to royalty of an unelected superclass, socially sophisticated, and as far as the human hierarchy goes, with either the feeling of superiority or the recognition of superiority, and that was imbued and transmitted through the colleges and the various ways of human stratification that people willingly submitted to for many years. But I think we're reaching a point where we're starting to question that. We've all seen the pictures, and this group is very cohesive and socially cohesive. I don't know and usually shy away from the presence of a master plan, although it may exist. I think it just really has more to do with this social cohesiveness and this gathering of rare leadership types that has just never occurred in world history. And I think it's had a demonstrable effect. And today we'll kick around where this goes in light of the new emergence of the COVID-19 and how that's likely to affect the mobility and some of the other awareness that we're facing as we live in introverted existence, many of us in sheltering in place and with limited social contact. We're all of a sudden returning to a different mode of looking at the world.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I think that's a great way to look at this whole picture, is to think about it in terms of mobility and the historical context of that mobility. And didn't know you were going to mention it, but when you mentioned Standard Oil, the first thing I thought of was, in my parents' generation, there was a general consensus among blue-collar workers that there was something that what didn't quite smell right, or, to put it very mildly, of the Rockefeller-based Standard Oil and the whole monopoly system around that. And there was a consensus in the American psyche at that time that we, the people, had to come together to fight this big behemoth. And there was the Sherman Antitrust Act, and there was all of that. But it was, the people were still controlled. And what we're dealing with, in my view, of this centuries-long struggle between the ruling class and the blue-collar workers, or the those that do the manual labor and those that make the system work at whatever level, that it's that we are, as the human species, being controlled to one degree or another by those that have the historical position of sitting at the top and making things happen the way they want to. And the reason we're here as Poli-Psych Podcast is to help people to see this in action in real time, and to look back over history, and we can see that this is a pattern, that we've been conditioned to behave in certain ways. So for instance, with the example of Standard Oil, few people would ask, well, why, how could they even build a monopoly? What was behind that? And there's some pretty simple things that most people don't really think of for right off. And they think, well, the internal combustion engine just sort of happened. That was a natural process. And then we have people buying up the oil wells and the refineries and all of that. Well, yeah, that's true. But actually, if you look further into it, you see that oil was chosen because it would, all the internal linkages that would be necessary to build a system of transportation around oil, and then all that infrastructure that would be necessary, that wouldn't necessarily be necessary with other means of propulsion like an electrical or battery based and all of this stuff. So steam, it was another possibility, steam from many different sources. So these people not only put the funds behind the things that become the breakthroughs today, it's the mobile technology of phones and communication devices, they engineer how that breaks into society. So my big example, of course, as an American, is the American culture was supposed to break us out of this control matrix. But did it really? As we look back and we see what's happening as we talked about last week on our show, we talked about President Trump pulling back the curtain where you could see these dueling narratives in real time, and we realized there are people that are behind a eugenics operation, that are behind culling humanity, that are trying to do this operation again. And they're using that whole mobility thing to lock us down. They're saying, well, we let Henry Ford produce cars for the masses, but we're not going to let you use those anymore, or at least not when we say we are. But once people see it, once people see that that's an agenda that's actually happening right in front of their eyes, it loses its magic, it loses its control. And one of the things that we treated as Poli-Psych today was that humans have always been more controlled by psychological manipulation than by laws. That's why we're here. We're going to expose that. Thus, this is why the QAnon group has said, enjoy the show. Why? Because once you see that it's a show, the show loses its power to control you. So if you think America is a free society and that all of this stuff is just built naturally, you're watching a show, but you don't know you're watching a show. So when someone tells you to enjoy the show, you go, what do you mean? It's a show? You mean it's not real? So what's happening now in this event or this process that is being referred to as the Great Awakening is we're seeing that it's a show that's being run by these people that have this mindset of societal control, and they've been doing it for a while, for at least hundreds of years. And are they the same people? Of course not. Some of the same families, yeah, but new families come and go. It's not all strictly by upbringing. Then you have defectors that actually turn out to be good guys, and John F. Kennedy's a prime example. But that's sort of what I see happening, and we'll delve a little bit deeper into this as we go forward.
Well, I actually, I mean, there's so much to say. I'm not sure where to begin. I think there are two sides of this. What people believe about the ruling class and what the ruling class believes about themselves. And I think the whole idea of a ruling class begs the question, why do they presume this power? And honestly, I can go back in European history, late medieval, to the extent that we know what was going on. And around that time, I could see a purpose for a king, and that whole structure of lords. I get it, because at that time, the kings, the rulers, would accept the responsibility. They would shoulder the burden for the people. And if the people went out to war, the king went out to war. It wasn't, there was a stratification, but everybody had a place that made sense. And in our world now, as this world ruler group has evolved, I want to propose that they are obsolete, because I can't help but think of the time machine. And I know one group was the Morlocks. I think it was the Morlocks and Eloi, that the ruling class became so separated from reality and everyday life that they were obsolete, to the extent that the working class began to consider them their cattle. So, and I'm not proposing that at all. I'm just saying, it doesn't work to have this ruling class that doesn't really serve the people. And again, I want to go back to the kings and put it maybe a little bit in Christian terms of what Jesus said: the greatest among you will be the servant of all. I believe there probably were kings and lords on different places in the structure who truly did serve their people. And I'm not advocating for serfdom or anything like that. But, as a parent, you can kind of understand that there might be some rulers who would indeed bear the burden of the people and carry them in their hearts and desire good for them. So historically, I get where this came from. But again, in today's world, they're obsolete. They're no longer the servants. They're the controllers and the manipulators. And, pretty soon, I think people will just be, if things continue on the course and there aren't major arrests, I think eventually people will just realize that we've been had by these people, and we'll just begin to ignore them and figure out where their money is flowing and stop believing their commercials, their press releases, whatever. So this is not something that can follow humanity very far into the future as it is now.
Cindy, if we could punch up the population distribution in MBTI, I think I'll launch into the Myers-Briggs a little bit, and then maybe we can get some Enneagram insight into this. The human experiment is an experiment in diversity. I think there's definitely since we're social animals, there's also a hierarchy. I think it's relatively secondary to the human right of self-determination that all men are created equal. It's the bedrock of the Constitution. So there's kind of a gray area between, who's right for the job. It really depends on what the job is. So the MBTI is very clearly distributed amongst the population so that you have not as many chiefs as Indians, because if you just have conceptuals, the whole world is conceptual. And things don't get done that need to get done as far as fixing the roof and growing food and all these things. So not that one is better than the other. That's not the case. The whole system has to have that diversity where people are getting their psychic energy from different modes of being. I think everyone is capable of thought, intuition, feeling, and sensing. It's just that we're drawn into getting more energy from one or the other. And that's kind of what the cultures that have flourished have had, that diversity population-wise. But what I did notice with what we call the ruling class when you see these pictures of just, they go on and on. There's George Soros with Bill Gates. Actually, that one's hard to find, but there's a very clear social group at work here, and they all seem to be rare types that normally would not encounter each other in a normal population distribution. And there's a very big prevalence of ENTJ, or at least the NT in Myers-Briggs, the second and third letter, and that would be the intuitive thinker. And we have George Soros belonging to that group, Bill Gates, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and the list goes on and on. Now, these are very rare types in the population, but with the advent with the transportation revolution, all of a sudden these people can actually meet each other and form large cohesive groups, very large groups of up to, I'd say, 150 people, where they actually know each other personally. And that's kind of what we're seeing, this invisible, unelected ruling class. And that's where, we talk about globalism, but it's a real thing. They don't self-identify as globalists. I don't think anybody ever self-identifies their own group in linguistic terms for the viewer. But nevertheless, it's pretty obvious, taking a step back, that there is an agenda. It may not be overt as much as just this sort of air of superiority and constant reminders of such. But that's one of the things that's being called into question with this corona, with some of the unintended, I think they were unintended consequences until we see real evidence that this was somehow in the intended consequence. But I doubt it was. I think for lack of a better term, the genie got out of the bottle. These definitely came from labs. We know that's a fact, that the NIH actually did fund the lab in China. That's a established fact. I personally think it was an accident. We'll go around the table a little and kick that around, but at least at this point, we see the effects. I think the effects are more important than the cause, but one of the effects will be to cast more light on this ruling class. And I think that's starting to happen. I think many people have sort of lost confidence in them from all the associations that we see, which may not mean anything more than social. It's a socially cohesive group, but there's a reason for that, and the reason is they're attracted to each other because they can facilitate their desire for control, and maybe they, in their own minds, look at themselves as being beneficial to humanity, but yet they're assuming something that they're not entitled to assume, that they have the right to form a virtual government to rule over people who have not decided that that's the way they want to go.
Remembering what Cindy had said about the kings and that there were good kings, what had happened at that stage of the game, and we're talking, almost 1,000 years ago or so, when that was the prevalent form of many local governments, what happened was you'd have a group of people that would be supporting the king, barons, or whatever title they might have, and then they were the aristocracy of the day, and then they would select, in the case of the monarchy in British culture, then they would select the new king, and it wasn't necessarily a hereditary thing. But anyway, this culture would build up around the monarchy or the centralized power structure, and those would be the people that wielded power over the rest of the people. So there was a transition of power through a group that was highly skilled in whatever means were necessary to control the general population. Now, in Enneagram terms, I don't know that there's any way to characterize these people, because I think it's whatever skill are needed to do the job, but also they would need to be of a mindset that this would be something that's desirable. Now, also in the case of these secondary controllers, there would be people that would be benevolent, that would have the best interest of the people at heart, but that they would also recognize that these people were controllable, that was their job. Now, in modern culture, we've seen Zbigniew Brzezinski's daughter, Mika, say exactly those words. It's our job to tell you what to think. Well, you know what? Americans have actually grown up beyond that. In fact, we were founded with the idea that we were going to take responsibility for what we believed was true. So what we're seeing happen in real time now in this cultural battle that we're in, that President Trump is pulling the curtain back on, we're seeing that these people are being unmasked and that there has been an attempt to impose an aristocracy. And it didn't happen overnight. It's been happening over decades, if not more than a century, and we're just now seeing it. So in terms of the Enneagram, how would you see this? Since I want to tie that in, it's basically there are levels of health in all of the Enneagram types. And Rizzo and Hudson's book, The Wisdom of the Enneagram, makes that really clear. There's a chart for each of the 9 types in terms of their level of health, and the very lowest levels of health tend to be very sociopathic. They would feed on the other group of people. It would be like predators and prey. So being able to see how the different Enneagram types would do this is useful, to be able to recognize sociopathic behavior in different forms. Sometimes it's introverted, sometimes it's extroverted, sometimes it's sensing, sometimes it's intuitive in the MBTI terms. But there are groups of people that do this, and so what's the underlying cause? Why has our modern culture deteriorated this way? I believe the root cause is the money monopoly system. When we no longer have a free economy, people that's determined on the basis of a mutual agreement of what's valuable. If you have centralized control that dictates in a top-down fashion what value is, and you no longer have a free market. Well, that's the world we've been living in since the beginning of the federal founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913, and then it's gone worldwide, basically, in the banking system throughout the world. So that is not really a psychological answer, except that it is. In a monopoly form, people that form a monopoly, they are predatory. They're beginning to control people, and they did that before in other ways before they took control of the monetary system. But the founding fathers of America were aware of the developments of an incipient form of this same group of people, and they warned of it. There was the Bavarian Illuminati. Front man was Adam Weishaupt, and there were probably other people behind him, but control has always been their agenda. And George Washington warned about them as a Mason, and people like to come down against George Washington because they see the Masonic order as being infiltrated. But that's actually what George Washington was warning of. Now, you might not even agree with all of the religious ideas of the Masonic order at the time that George Washington was a Mason, but they weren't about controlling other people except perhaps in a benevolent way. And again, this is what was actually necessary in early American culture in order to organize against tyranny so that they had a fighting chance. There was a network of lodges that made that possible. So in forming a free society, humans in that day needed to come together in ways that couldn't be penetrated by their enemy, and they did that in these lodges. So from that time in Western culture, there's been private or secret groups that had a larger agenda, sometimes good, sometimes bad. We're oftentimes only aware of those that had a nefarious control agenda, but the point I'm making about Washington in that day was they needed a private group in order to keep the enemy from know what they were doing. If you've ever heard of the TV program or series called Turned, I believe it is, where it's based on the book Washington Spies. And there was a whole network that was made possible because these people were organized privately. And some would say secretly, but really there's a difference between being private and being secret. I'll leave it there and see what Cindy has to say.
Well, an aspect of this, we mentioned in the intro that there's a religious aspect, and it's dark. I'm laughing because I'm thinking of a line from an Addams Family movie where a psychologist is describing to someone why something happened, and I think it was Gomez Addams, and he said, "Is it dark?" Because he wanted it to be dark. We don't necessarily want it to be dark, but some of these aspects are, in order to really understand what the impact is on our culture of some of these social controllers, I think it's necessary to see this aspect of their motivation, that many of them evidently have made decisions that, I guess I'm thinking of the expression, it's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. I believe that may be a conclusion that some of these people have reached, that they really don't want to be servants. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to go there and speculate because I don't know for a fact. But we do see some very dark aspects, I won't even say dark, I'll just say creepy. And I'm showing some images. This one is from Eyes Wide Shut, as is this one, which I think, is that an exaggeration? I don't know. Stanley Kubrick didn't live very long after he completed filming. I don't want to follow that rabbit trail. But for anybody who looks just a little bit and does a little bit of research, this dark side of these people will become evident. And one thing, aspect of this that has been very impactful in the last years, especially in the 2016 election, was the John Podesta emails. And I don't even really want to get into it that deeply. I think it's best if people do their own research. And by doing their own research, what I mean is actually finding quotes and portions of the emails and interpreting according to, maybe a little bit of background information, what they mean. And it's clear, and this isn't even subtle or hidden. They were talking about some of the emails referenced Marina Abramovic and some of her spirit cooking dinners. And this is right there, right out in the public. And again, there's no mystery of this. There are photographs of Marina Abramovic with many different people. And what they do at their parties is they imitate cannibalism. Now, do they practice actual cannibalism? It's not clear, but it's obvious from photos that are very public from some of their parties that they have. Here's one with head on the table, a body on the table, a head on the table. This is part of their meal. They create, Marina and her crew create food that look like people so that they can simulate cannibalism. Are they actual cannibals? I don't know. But this is not mainstream humanity. And as Don was mentioning, the predatory aspect, you see this as art, whatever. It's predatory. If you're thinking about eating someone or even pretending to eat a human being, you, as far as I'm concerned, you are a predator. So I think that, maybe the takeaway for anybody who's listening is do some research. If you are enamored of, the Britain's royal family, or the Bushes in America, or Bill Gates and some of these other people, so look up the ENTJs and go through the ENTJs on Personality Database and see which ones you're fans of, and maybe do a little research on them, because there is some dark shadows. I hate using that term because it calls to mind a vampire show, but these people they cast long and dark shadows. And I believe in many respects, many of them are predatory, as is obvious, as Don said. The very fact that they would want to create a monopoly is predatory. So I guess that's what I'm thinking right now.
They do display what I would call an arrogant flamboyance that was very common and really reached a crescendo right before the election of Donald Trump. And they really didn't think that he would win. Hillary was going to win. And that's why there's so much evidence just laying around. At times, I know they do cross a line that shouldn't be crossed. But I'll just say at times I think they might be trolling us in some way. And the one example, it's a minor example, but I think Chelsea Clinton may have tweeted at one time that she's going out in the backyard to sacrifice a chicken to Moloch, or something of that sort. But again, we troll the other side at times. Donald Trump does with his recitation that he's going to win in 2020 and 2024, 2028, 2032, and you'll see the graphic that came out of the Trump war room that shows that going all the way to 2030, just way beyond that. But the other side took that and ran with it. But there's an imbalance here that I see, and it really is almost as if these people have gotten so self-satisfied and so confident in their superiority that they've just extended the bounds of decency. And I don't know how serious they are about these things, but nevertheless, promoting that is just a huge tell that they're coming from a dark place, and maybe they don't even understand it themselves. But it's pretty evident now, and I think in terms of historical judgment, it will be brutal. I think as people go forward, we look back on the Nazi era, but in the end, these strategies don't work. And the whole thing with the Nazism, I think, is it's really, and people still follow that, and it's really a philosophy of self-destruction. They know what happened to Hitler, and it was one of the most politically implausible, where you take a whole section of your electorate and just start exterminating them. I mean, it's not going to work, and it's definitely not going to work these days, but you still have people going around following this because they're attracted to the dark side of this archetype. And the archetypes, Carl Jung said this, are intoxicating. They're intoxicating to both sides. And I try to resist some of the framework of the Illuminati and some of the other stories for that reason. Is if we can, as long as we can treat them as what they are, as they're mythologies that sometimes do make sense of the world, and there might be truth. There's truth in every archetype, but we just can't get attached to too many of them as an explanation for reality. So, going back to something you said, Don, about fossil fuels, I remember and I won't be able to quote this exactly, but there's they call him a survivalist, but he's just more of I think he's more of a philosopher, but Dmitry Orlov, and he one time said something that really didn't sink in right away, and it was that technology is always serving the benefit of the inventor or the sponsor of that technology. So there was something you said, Don, about the the gasoline powered automobile, and that actually is true. When I looked at it, if you look at the history of Standard Oil, they actually were already making a substantial amount of money from lamp oil, and they were harvesting oil from right from the late 1800s, and magically all of a sudden they figured out a way to turn this oil into gasoline, which now we think of that as the primary output, but it was not at the time. So the how the invention went, I don't know what other alternatives it could have reached, but I will say this is that electricity is not an energy source, it's a conveyance, and the same goes for water. So I'm not sure what else they would have used, but it has proven to be a magic carpet of our age, and reflected in the current price of that commodity, which is going down. We're at a period where we're probably temporarily taking that out of play. And it's interesting to see the inverse of that when you have oil become cheaper than water. The philosophy that follows that, the vision that people will get, I think they'll take with them for the rest of their lives. And I think we will pull through this, but we aren't going back. And I'll close by saying that the globalist ideology is virtually dead at this point. It'll take a little bit longer, but I don't think people will ever go back to trusting in this transnational elite again for any reason. And that's why that's why people like Fauci and Dr. Birx have so much trouble getting credibility, because we have these photographs of them wining and dining with this same ruling class that is just gradually losing its support from the mobility, losing support from the cross-border permeability that they were promoting so actively. And until we defeat the virus, I think we'll always be on guard for another one. We're not going back to the old, what essentially will become the old world, although it's hard to see at the moment.
Okay, I really appreciate that. What you said in the first part of your presentation there, Ken, which was that don't be careful of being trolled. And what does that do? That draws you into a battle that you would do better to avoid. It makes you a target, and just don't fall for it. This is a tactic that information warfare people should recognize fairly easily, and but it's actually a bigger picture than that, even than modern day information warfare. It's the whole idea of you could think of it in spiritual terms as the enemy outside of yourself as being more real than the enemy inside, and we're better off following a spiritual path and being at peace within ourselves, and then whatever we engage outside, to be able to deal with that without being drawn into a battle, just by shining the light of truth and saying, well, this is the way I see that, and then let reality unfold from there, instead of being drawn into a battle that you really can't win because the two sides have been set up in a polarity fashion. Now, I purposely, when I talked about the Masons before, I emphasized the difference between George Washington and Adam Weishaupt. But I want to also mention that my introduction to the whole arena of conspiracy theories was in the 1980s through a book that came out called The Unseen Hand, an introduction to the conspiratorial view of history. And I had in my mindset at that time as a new Christian that I was not going to be one of these people that saw Satan under every rock and was going to be drawn into that continual focus on the enemy. And in spite of that, though, I wanted to be well informed. And I found that this book was so extensively footnoted and researched of all of the connections, especially of Masonic orders, but other groups as well, that it really wasn't possible to argue with the thesis that there have been throughout history groups of people controlling the larger mass of humanity. And one of the common symbols of that many people will know about is photos and pictures before there were photography of rulers with their hands inside of their coats. And that was a message saying that they were an agent of the unseen hand. That was a message saying, look, I'm being given the stage. I've been given this power by people that I serve that are not there. They are the unseen hand, and I am just the front man. So that has been a theme throughout history, this whole idea of the unseen hand, and I recommend the research in Ralph Epperson's book. It's just top-notch. It's not the full picture, but if you seriously consider it, you'll have an understanding that this is very real, very documented, and there was a whole period in American history called the anti-Masonic movement that was in the, I believe, the middle 1800s, in which the Illuminati infiltration of the Masons had become a serious problem and was about controlling American politics. So there was a movement to expose the Masonic orders in that period of American history. But also, again, tying into something that Ken said, sometimes maybe these people are just a group of well-connected people that enjoy one another's company and form a social group at the higher levels of society, and they're recognized as such. I think there's a modern equivalent to what's been described in the past as porch masons. Now, the Masonic orders, as an example, not saying that they're the Illuminati, but as an example of a group that's operated behind the scenes with secret levels of initiation, et cetera, they have people that, or the terminology is used to describe their initiates and first order people as porch masons. So a porch mason is somebody that isn't even really inside the house, but they believe that the house is theirs, and they are greeters at the entrance. They tell people what a great house it is, and the people go in the door. Well, and then those people move beyond them into the higher orders. That whole idea of a porch mason is, I believe, completely transferable to the modern stars of today in Hollywood that are promoting the Illuminati. I'm thinking of Tom Hanks' son and other celebrities that are really excited about how great the Illuminati is. So their idea of the Illuminati is roughly equivalent to that of the porch mason who just shows people the door and then, just thinks it's really cool. And they're not the real leaders. They're the front man. So when Ken was talking about this inner networking group of people that are prominent in the society, that transfers in my mind to the whole idea, the concept of a porch mason. They're the people that show you the front door. They're the people that attract in the people that want to be rich and powerful, like those modern day porch masons. And before I get into the next thing, I think Cindy might actually want to talk about the next guy on my list before I even mention it and monopolize too much time. But I know she probably has some other things as well.
Quickly interject. The one thing I notice about the whole issue, especially with the release of the DNC emails, is sometimes we'll focus on the flamboyant aspects and Podesta's artwork, and these things are very bad naturally, but we do tend to, at times, I think, as a group of the whole country, forget about the fact that the potential murder of Seth Rich was actually, or the murder of somebody was actually discussed openly. And many times the people I think we should focus on are the ones you don't hear about, the ones that are not being flamboyant. And I think that'll come to light when we look at the Mueller probe, that Weissman was hiding behind Mueller, and we have Peter Strzok and these people. They were smart enough not to get involved in all this, or at least if they did, to keep it well under the radar, whereas some of these other people were just completely open about it. So I'm hoping that we don't get thrown off the trail by going into areas that are either troll traps or are just not going to be prosecuted, because there's just the attorneys know and advise these people and they know that a lot of these things will never get to court because there's just one little thing that'll happen right at the end that'll prevent that from happening, and that's their insurance policy.
Just to recap what Ken said about with his example of Mueller as being the front for Andrew Weissmann, that this is a magician's trick. You put the thing on the French porch or the fancy thing, and the real thing that's the real danger is the person that you don't see. And that's the magician's trick. That's what's been done throughout history. That's what's being done. But even though Robert Mueller has a very dark past himself, he's not perhaps as on top of it nor as vicious as Weissmann.
I think, just interject briefly, Joe Biden. I think we saw some similar developments, possibly starting with Robert Mueller. I mean, I think his performance before Congress was kind of shocking, I think, to almost everyone. And the ongoing Joe Biden situation, lends credence to your observation.
Yeah. And so this happens repeatedly. Is you get a front man who's relatively benign or used up, and then the real viciousness happens through other means. And I just want to alert people that is something we'll see in operation through this coming presidential election season.
Ken, you earlier said that we were going to go around the table and see how this tied in with coronavirus and what's been going on. So I have a couple links. One is Bill Gates predicted coronavirus-like outbreak in 2019 Netflix documentary. And so, Bill Gates, we don't really, he was a part of IBM. And, these people, if there is a ruling class, there may be new initiates, as you both said, but many of the key players are going to be people who have been around a while and families that have been around a while. Bill Gates' family, even though Bill Gates has been presented to us as this brilliant entrepreneur that just came up with this idea about computers, well, no. He's from a family who were involved in IBM. So this is relevant to coronavirus because Bill Gates' name has been linked with various patents having to do with the coronavirus and his push for vaccines. And while we're on the subject of coronavirus, I just want to ask this question that's a rhetorical question. If you were sick, would you rather have a vaccine or a test or a cure? And the press is obsessed with tests and vaccines, but they avoid almost at all costs talking about a cure unless it's remdesivir or whatever, that there's an expensive patent. Nobody wants to talk about hydrochloroquine, which is inexpensive and the use is established for other purposes. It's proven safe. So there's that aspect of Bill Gates. And there's also this Event 201, and it was a simulation of coronavirus, and the actual virus played out in a very similar way to Event 201. So I don't really want to get into that. Again, this is something that if people are curious, they can research on their own. But just to say, there does seem to be a conspiracy behind many different aspects of the coronavirus, COVID-19. There seems to be a conspiracy behind how it was developed, maybe how it was released, how it's being addressed by the press, and how it's being used to try to make the president appear foolish and inept. So people shy away from the word conspiracy, and I think this is what I'll close with. People don't want to be labeled a conspiracy theorist. That's a term that came up with the CIA came up with in order to make people stop theorizing about what really happened to JFK. If there is a conspiracy, all that means is that people conspired together to secretly accomplish something. And so many times there is a conspiracy. And I believe that in talking about some of these things, it's important that we get over the fear of that word and use that word. There probably was a conspiracy here. Now, do I know that for a fact? No. I'm theorizing. There's nothing wrong with theorizing, as long as we're not stating something as a hard, cold fact. So that's a lot of what we do when we produce these videos. We pull together ideas and facts and history and psychology and try to make determinations about what is going on, what's really true, because the truth is something that needs to be pursued. It's not just out there in the open, and that's what the press used to do. So we are the news now, as Q says, you are the news. So that's all we're trying to do. We're trying to theorize about whether there have been conspiracies or not.
And I would add that almost every time you see a monopoly, even though it's called a natural monopoly, I don't believe there is such a thing. I believe that you are actually witnessing the end results of collusive behavior, collusion, and monopoly practices in action. And sometimes that's good. The end result would be good because they are not both VHS and Betamax, and people having to have two of everything. It's good to standardize, but why not have that whole process be more open instead of being decided between people who don't want to be known to the public or don't want to have that process be known to the public? And yeah, that is conspiratorial behavior because you're not open about it.
So to the curious, the seekers, and the experts, thank you for joining us for this episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. If you have enjoyed this presentation, we ask that you would please click like, subscribe to us on BitChute, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter. You'll have a good time with that if you're a Twitter file. And if you have a moment, visit our website. Again, thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay well and take care.